Welcome back to the second part of our story. So, initially, we were talking about how humans were compared with other great apes, particularly chimpanzees, and also how the archaeological record of humans' encounters with Neanderthals in particular might reveal something about human nature, and in particular about our kind of intelligence and how we should think about intelligence, whether we should think about intelligence as a cleverness that allows one to succeed at games in which one is competing with others, or whether we should think about intelligence perhaps in a different capacity. So earlier we saw that humans actually score lower or not any better than great apes when they're toddlers at baseline intelligence tests. Now, how do they measure up to Neanderthals, an earlier form of human that existed in Europe and that eventually encountered humans around 50 to 65,000 years ago? Well, what were Neanderthals like? From what we understand, Neanderthals were extremely strong. They were apex predators that competed with other apex predators like cave bears, saber-toothed tigers, and packs of hyenas for hunting meat. They, far from being stupid or untechnologically advanced, Neanderthals had a really complex material culture. They were, for example, able to navigate craft across parts of the Mediterranean. We know that they were seagoing. We know that they were capable of symbolic thought, that they produced artwork of various kinds, including paintings, but also perhaps musical instruments and other kinds of ornaments, that they buried their dead. And there is indeed some evidence to suggest that Homo sapiens, that is, modern humans, began burying their dead only after encounters with the Neanderthals. So it's quite possible that the Neanderthals taught us, in our encounters with them, a number of different cultural forms, advanced cultural traditions. So the question then is, what happened to Neanderthals? Why did they die out if they were in fact not these savage, chest-thumping cavemen who were stupid, and we humans weren't some kind of advanced race relative to them? That's not what the fossil record shows. So for a long time, people assumed the worst of humans, in keeping with what we have tended to think of ourselves. We believed that humans exterminated the Neanderthals species of human beings, that we committed genocide. It was the first kind of, there's no real evidence to conclude that this is the case, but when presented with the fact that once humans arrived on the continent of Europe, several thousand of years later, Neanderthals disappeared. Well, it's actually tens of thousands of years later. People just assumed, they naturally went with what they feel about human beings, which is that we exterminate anything that we perceive as a threat. But gradually, we began to understand that this theory doesn't really hold up. So, for example, there isn't any evidence of any kind of war or conflict between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, but in fact, we do know that humans interbred quite extensively with groups of Neanderthals. That is, that when we encountered them, we tended to mate with them and produce offspring. And in fact, when the human genome is measured, it turns out that somewhere between 2 to 4% of our DNA is actually Neanderthal DNA, right? Which means that there was quite extensive intermingling between the groups, especially when you consider that there were more Homo sapiens, quite a bit more than there were Neanderthals. So it was also a time of great instability in terms of climate change. There was an ice age that took place that put a lot of pressure on the different human species, the different populations within Europe. So the fact that the Neanderthals died out, even though given that they were a much smaller group, when Homo sapiens arrived, it seems more likely that in general, while there may have been some conflict, I'm not saying there wasn't any, but that in general, we likely absorbed them into Homo sapiens gene pool, and did so through making ties, both mating ties and probably friendship ties as well. So this is what the evidence seems to show. Now, the question then becomes, what is it about Homo sapiens that did make us so successful? Why, for example, did we absorb the Neanderthals instead of them absorbing us? Why was it true that when we arrived in Europe, we were able to produce many more offspring than they ever were? Was it because we were better hunters? No. Was it because we were more fit or stronger? No. Was it because we were smarter on an individual level? No. So what was the answer? And for this mystery, Bregman looks into the history of how groups can actually produce personality traits and select for personality traits through a breeding that is through mating. So he looks at silver foxes, which is a very fierce animal, and an experiment that Russian geneticists, it's ongoing to this day, but it goes back to the 1950s and 60s, undertook, which was to breed a dog that is a loyal, friendly animal from a very fierce and sort of kind of protective and defensive animal, the silver fox. So these Russian geneticists went through this process where they selected for friendliness. That's all they basically did was create a kind of relationship with these foxes, and ultimately they created a species that was distinct from the silver fox. It looked identical, but it behaved completely differently. And the newborn foxes behaved completely differently than the other newborn foxes. That is, they were much friendlier, much more social and outgoing. The theory here is that Homo sapiens evolved for and selected for, within their own group, friendliness, to put a kind of a general term on it. That is, we selected mates based on their generosity, their kindness, their overall sociability, their communicative skills, their capacity to communicate with one another, and their loyalty and their warmth. And over time, this created a hypersocial animal, a hypersocial brain within a hypersocial species. And Homo sapiens emerged from this self-selection process, that who we are now is a function of the kinds of decisions that our ancestors made about who to mate with and who to have children with tens of thousands of years ago. And Bregman provides us with a number of different features that some people believe are evolutionary adaptations to being a product of a kind of a hyper-social environmental selection process. Blushing is one of these that he points out, that even though some of us like to believe that we're difficult to read, for most humans, reading other people's emotions comes extremely naturally, and we do it when we're at a very young age. And blushing is just another way in which we have to let each other know how we're feeling. Also, humans have evolved the capacity to look one another in the eye, right? And the whites of our eyes tell us in which direction each other's eyes are directed, which psychologists and social psychologists conclude is very beneficial to the building of social trust. Finally, we've had sort of game theorists examine what would happen if you had two species more or less equally smart, although perhaps in some cases some individuals would be more intelligent than others. But one species was particularly good at social learning, right? So we can create a kind of an algorithm to crunch these numbers. In fact, you don't even need an algorithm to do it. And it turns out that what social psychologists call copycats, mimics, people who learn from others, spread ideas much more rapidly than any individual genius level intelligence could ever do, right? So social learning then becomes a kind of superpower by which one invention, say being able to sew clothes so that you can stay warm in extremely cold environments, as opposed to just throwing on layers, right? Wrapping skins around you. That single invention can spread in just a couple of 100 years across an entire continent, even when you're talking about wandering bands of foragers and hunter-gatherers, right? So this capacity for social learning, then, we go back to the original intelligence tests with the chimps and the orangutans, and humans are off the charts compared to these other great primates. We are exceptionally much, much better at social learning. That is much, much better at when you show someone what to do, when you have another person do it, we tend to watch, focus, and are able to adopt it. So it's not monkey see, monkey do. It's human see, human do, much more realistically. So finally, Bregman leaves us with this idea that perhaps it's not the world of hunter-gatherers, of foragers, that is so dark and Hobbesian in the sense that, you know, it saw anarchy and war and conflict, but perhaps it's more the modern world that we live in that is more accurately Hobbesian, right? And it might even be a reflection of Hobbes himself developing this idea that has perhaps produced the modern world's hyper-competitive features, right? And its extremely strict sets of regulations, and its very powerful police forces that seek to massively regulate anything that is suggestive of disorder. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed part 2. We'll see you next time.